Welcome, everybody, to the podcast. This is episode 12 of What's on Your Workbench. Welcome back, everybody. We've got a bit of a special episode today. We are going to be talking tool maintenance and the maintenance on our workbench. There is never any maintenance on my workbench, so I'm glad we are talking about it. Today, as always, we have Chili with us. Chili, how are you doing?
I am splendid. How are you today, sir?
I am good. I suppose I should introduce myself too. I am Andrew from craftybeetroot.com, and Chili is from Allwood Solutions, and we'll get to the details of that later. But this is something that I know you have wanted to talk about for many, many weeks, and I have been trying to avoid for many, many years of my life, and that is tool maintenance. And it's probably one of the most important things really in the workshop. Obviously, the tools that keep us safe is a well-maintained tool. So my general approach to maintenance is buy a tool, buy a cheap tool, use it until it basically has either been destroyed or it has earned my respect, then maintain it and bring it up to a nice spec and then look after it for the rest of its life. Or buy something expensive and just assume that because it was expensive, I don't have to do anything with it. And I assume that's 100% correct, Chili, and we don't need to continue with the episode.
Oh my gosh. Oh man.
It's only partially true.
My goal is to convert you today to the ways of shop maintenance.
Okay, convert me.
All right. So I have a bevy of tools and goodies laid out on my workbench to kind of talk about this. In all honesty, this will be probably an episode that would be beneficial to watch on YouTube if you are listening to us on Podbean and you're just trying to find something to help you fall asleep. I'm sure this will be perfect. But if you actually want to garner something from this, I would probably recommend you check out our YouTube one for this. But let's start somewhere very, very simple. And that is with the things in our shop that are the tools in our shop that have wood. So whether it's something like this wooden mallet that I made, or our chisels that have wood handles, hammers, saws that have wood handles. Yes. These are some of the easiest tools to neglect, but they're also the easiest to maintain. That's the good news. So my mallet, for instance, is about due for this, but about once a year, depending on your climate, you want to make sure that you're refreshing the finish on the wood tools you have in your shop, wood handled tools, things like that. And it's super, super, super easy to do. All I do is I mix up a really nice batch of oil varnish blend. So that's about, for me, I really like using a 1:1:1 ratio, and I am alone in that. Like everybody else will be, all over the board. The climate I'm in is very, very, very dry. So I don't need to use as much solvent as a lot of folks do. A lot of folks will do like a 3-2-1 of 3 solvent, 2 varnish, 1 oil, or some people switch that and do 1 part varnish, 2 parts oil. You're going to find what works for you. But I mix up a batch of that and I do all my wood handled tools, wood tools all at once. So planes, chisels, saw handles, my mallet. And the first thing I'll do is I'll take some 4/0 steel wool. So if you go to the hardware store, wood supply store, anything like that, you're going to find packages of steel wool, and it will hopefully look a little bit better than what Andrew is holding in his hands. But you'll see a package that has 10, it says number 0, number 00, number 000, or we go to full binary and go number 0000, which is just called 4/0 steel wool. That's what you want. It's super fine. We're going to just rub down all of our stuff that we're going to refinish. And all that does is put very microscopic scratches in the surface so that our new finish has something to bind to. Once I get that done, all I do is I take that oil varnish blend with a rag and I wipe it on. Just wipe it on everything nice and liberally. And then as soon as I wipe it on, I'm going to take a clean rag and buff it out. So wiping off any excess and buffing out that finish. And that's going to give you a finish that is really good on your hands and won't make you blister. Because that's a huge thing. If you do like straight varnish where you put, God forbid, urethane on your tools, your hands will blister so bad. Most tools, when you buy them new, like if you're getting stuff from the big box store or Harbor Freight or somewhere like that, they have horrible finishes on them and you will blister so bad. So I knock those down first thing when I get them. But that's a real simple thing to do, and it keeps your wood from cracking, because the worst thing you could do is have a really nice tool with a wood handle and the tool still is great, but your handle is trashed because you never took care of it.
So my current technique of, if I just happen to be painting something with urethane and my wooden tool is right next to it and I just go, whatever, I'll just put some of that on there while I'm at it, is not the advised technique.
Well, I'll tell you that the one really good thing about that is you are protecting the wood.
Which is so kind of, I like my mallet here, which is just a fairly cheap, nasty one. I believe I was doing some oiling of, so I had some linseed oil and I was just like, oh, well, I've got that. I'll just put that on that because I think this was fairly raw. So I have done that, but this is a really good point because a lot of my finer chisels, because I don't use them very often, they kind of sit over in their toolbox and I don't think about the wood at all. I'm more concerned about the metal and the rusting and that. And I haven't even thought about that. And the way you just described it is a lot less work than I would have imagined. So it's actually, I think, inspired me to have a look around the tool bench and actually maybe give them a bit of love, because there are some, I mean, a lot of my tools, most of them are plastic handles, but there are definitely some nice wood chisels that I definitely don't want to crack the wood on those. So
yeah, that's great. We're successful already. We have a convert.
It hasn't been done yet. Let's just be clear.
Now,
but at least if I do it, I'll probably do it the correct way and not just, oh, there's a spray paint, whatever that can go over the top of that.
What I do is I pick a day. Like I find a day that I have downtime in my schedule to do this.
Sorry.
Like I've got a gap in my production schedule. I go, great, this is the day I'm going to do some tool maintenance on wood stuff and get all that done. Depending on the workbench that you have, if you have a solid wood workbench, you want to do the same thing on your workbench surface.
My chipboard / plyboard probably.
Don't even worry about it then.
It's got plenty of paint all over it. I'm not too worried.
My original workbench I made, it was a plywood top. Like, no, I didn't do that on it. It's not worth it. But my nicer, solid wood bench, I do that, and that I do a little more frequently. I do that probably quarterly, just the top of it, just to make sure that it's sealed and I don't have to worry about it warping or anything like that.
Yeah, and I guess it goes without saying that tool maintenance starts with just kind of having an organized and a good storage space. It's going to be hard to keep things well maintained if stuff's just thrown in a corner. And I know from myself, just keeping my workspace clean, I'm much more likely to look after my tools and things like that because everything has its place. I can see it. And like you said, if there is a day where I'm just not really in the mood to work on something, I can just pull them out, and it's something I will probably do is just kind of pull them out and give them a quick clean up and give them a bit of a coat just to not have to do it later and to get some life out of those tools.
Yep, definitely. So the next thing we're going to talk about, and this one I cheat, honestly, to make it simple, but let's talk about saws. So you got to keep your saws sharp, or you're going to blow out your shoulder. And you're going to have rough, ugly, nasty cuts. You're going to burn wood. It's not good. So you need to make sure that you keep your saws sharpened. And if you're going to do this, if you want to tackle this yourself, I really, really recommend that you get a saw sharpening clamp. It's a very specific tool that is all metal, and it will clamp really close to your sharpening surfaces. So it's a big long clamp that clamps the whole blade and clamps it really up close. And then you go through and file each and every one of your teeth. And depending on what kind of saw you have, you'll use a different kind of file to make sure you get the correct profile onto that saw blade. This sucks. To be quite honest, I send my saws out. There are a ton of different companies. You probably have one locally that you can just drop them off and have them done. There's also a bunch that you can package them up and send them off in the mail, and they'll send them back to you nice and sharp. If you have, invested the money in a really nice saw, whether it be a gent saw, tenon saw, panel saw, dovetail saw, any of those, if you've spent the money on a really nice one, the company you purchased it from probably offers sharpening. And they're the best person to do it because they know their saws inside out, backward, front. So I'm going to keep that one short and sweet. My recommendation, pay somebody else to sharpen your saws. It's not worth it. Unless you just really want to get zen and spend a day with headphones and a little tiny file. Like, don't do it.
And I mean, and that one's for the hobbyist. If they're not using their saw every day, that one probably isn't a yearly thing. That one's probably once every couple of years kind of thing. It just depends on the use.
Yeah,
as soon as the saw isn't working for you, that's probably the time to. Because I've got some tools up there that I've had for 10 years, and yeah, they're probably now due for a sharpening. But even then, if you're using them correctly, they still cut really well for me. So I'm not.
Yeah.
Unless I'm trying to cut like nails or something, good things like
that. The saws that I have to sharpen the most are my rip cut saws, or the saws that I use for milling material, doing major cuts. Those are the ones that need it most often, and those ones I will touch up by myself. Just quickly with some diamond files like this, which are just a flat surface that have a diamond surface on it. They sharpen up really nicely. I'll show you what else I use those for in a second here. And I do that, maybe twice a year.
Yeah.
And then every couple of years I send them out. So that's a pretty easy one. But while we've got this diamond file out, let's talk about drill bits. So I have a rather large auger bit here as an example, because it'll be easier to see. But this is an auger bit from my brace and bit set, which is a hand crank drill. But the same will go for, for bits you use in a drill or anything like that. Now they sell really fancy machines to sharpen drill bits. I haven't found one yet that really is worth the money, frankly. And the other thing that I find beneficial about doing this process by hand, and same goes for some of the other things we're going to talk about, is that you're working on your fine dexterity as you're doing this. And whether you realize it or not, it's going to have a profound effect on your woodworking. You'll find that you start to make marks and cuts much more accurately as well as you hone those fine motor skills. So all we do on these is your lead edge of the bit is basically a plane or a chisel. It's just a flat sharpened wedge. And your bits may vary, but usually these old auger bits like this, they are beveled on the very bottom side. So the side that touches the wood, basically your drilling bevel side down. And they're really easy to get to. You just place your diamond sharpening stick across on the bevel. And I do only pull strokes across that bevel to get any nicks out. Actually, if there's nicks, I'll usually use a file first. If it's just dull, I'll use only the diamond stick. But I'm just going to pull that across the bevel just to hone that in until I have a burr on the bottom side. And you'll be able to feel that burr. It just kind of catches on your finger a little bit. And once you have a burr all the way across, then you put your diamond stick on the bottom side and do maybe 2-3 pulls is all, just to get that burr gone. And you'll have a really nice sharp bit again. So now that we've talked about saws and drill bits, those are the two things in your shop that you will probably most likely see a buildup on over time. And that buildup from the wood is the resin or the pitch or pine tar. Those are all terms for that resinous material in wood. And that builds up on saw blades and drill bits faster than anything else. Especially, Andrew, that fancy new / used bandsaw you have.
Yes.
Especially if you're using it on pine or on cedar. Some cedars will do it really quickly. You'll get a buildup on that blade.
Yep.
And it's really important to get that material off of your tool because it ruins the efficiency of your tool. And you end up working the machine or yourself way harder than you need to. On a machine, it can lead to burning out a motor or ruining bearings. On a hand tool, it's going to just exhaust you if you're using a tool that has buildup on it. So there are numerous manufacturers of chemical to clean that pine tar or pitch or resin off. If you have a woodworking store near you, I guarantee you they will have one. If you don't, you can order it quite easily. I usually get just like a gallon jug of it. And the really cool thing is the stuff is reusable. You don't have to pitch it once you use it. You can reuse it time and time again. I've had the same gallon of resin cleaner for, I don't know, probably 2 years. So all you do is you take those tools that are, covered, and you just soak them. Just soak them in this, remover. Let them sit. Sometimes an hour or two does it. Sometimes I let them sit overnight, and then I just have an old toothbrush that I go over and just kind of scrub all that off. So for a bandsaw blade, I find what works really nice is if you want to anger your spouse, you can use a round pan. If you don't want to anger your spouse, which I recommend,
do it when they're not at home.
Yeah, which an oil changing pan, like a round oil changing pan, works great. You wrap up your bandsaw, plop it in there, let it soak. For hand saws, it can be a little bit tricky to find something good enough to soak them in. I've seen people use like a trash piece of gutter, like from the house, and make a little trough that they can soak it in. I tend to just soak rags in that remover, and then I wrap those around the cutting edge of my saw and let it sit. The only downside with that is it's harder to reclaim that stuff than if you have, you know, a trough or something. That's all you do to remove that. It's super easy.
And I can't say I've had a huge problem with pitch buildup, but it's something I'll look out for. Maybe I'm just not. Maybe the woods I'm using are a lot drier and I'm not seeing it. But
and resin will affect you at any dryness. So I worked on the bench that I recently did, and I sculpted out the seat, and I did that with a power tool. Actually, it's an attachment that goes on an angle grinder and has these little tiny studs all over it, and it helps really sculpt it out fast. That piece of pine that I was doing that on had been cut, milled, and sitting in a garage for over 10 years. It was still the most resonant wood I have ever worked in my life. Like, it was insane. I couldn't sand the wood. Because the second I touched it with sandpaper, it just clogged my sandpaper.
I've definitely come across that. I think I was making some a file handle out of I won't show you too closely, but this is not a good example, but it was actually a piece of firewood that had like a real nice grain to it, and I ended up cutting that down and shaping that and making some file handles. And I think it was my biggest experience when I was like using files and stuff, and it would just dig up all that resin, and it was just super nasty to work with.
Files are a real big one too, especially if you don't have a rasp to do the bulk of your shaping, and then go to finer files. It'll really plug up your file, and you can do the same thing with those as we're talking about here. But where you'll probably notice it more than anything, Andrew, is on your bandsaw blade. That's where you will get it for sure. So what goes along with cleaning off resin is somebody who shall remain nameless, but they asked me about rust on their tools, because this person apparently has a whole drawer of rusty tools.
This one isn't even in the in my bench of, or my drawer of shame, we'll call it.
Well, I have really good news for you. This is also stupidly easy to take care of. It's going to be a very similar process to cleaning resin, but instead you're going to use something like, you can just use WD-40. That works perfectly fine. I prefer a product called PB Blaster. So PB like peanut butter. And you just let your rusty stuff soak in it. And it will dissolve the rust and break it down. And then you'll probably have to use more like a wire brush than just a toothbrush to get the rest of it knocked off. But
that's already
fine. The big thing is you really want to try to catch that while it's surface rust. Before that rust actually starts pitting the metal.
Unfortunately, most of my trouble bits are, the leftover drill bits from previous sets, or, stuff that's not really that useful. But I did check my files, or not my files, my chisels, and some of them are starting to get some surface rust. So I definitely need to look at those very soon. But I assume we'll get to chisels in a little bit.
So once you get rust off of your metal tools, it's really easy to keep it off.
That was my next question, is what's the best thing to keep it off?
super easy. Again, if you're just working with stuff you can get at, the big box store, you can use WD-40 for this. But you just coat your tools, put a spray on it and use a rag to make sure it's wiped all over, and put a nice little coat on your tool. Now, I prefer to use like either white lithium or silicone based product, because they don't seep into the wood I'm working on. That's
Okay.
a problem you might see if you use WD-40. Even though it's a very small trace amount on your tool, it can discolor your wood slightly.
Yep. No, that's
so a white lithium or a silicone-based product won't do that.
Okay, so that's good to know, because I think my goal will be to basically go through and get off all the rust and then treat all of that, because in my environment, it is quite humid. This is really the only time of the year where it's quite dry. And even then, like, it's funny because I lived in Colorado, where you can feel it in your skin as soon as you land. People land here and it's so humid. And we're like, what are you talking about? It's not even humid. Like, but there's just that consistent humidity in the air. And it's definitely one of those things that I've noticed. I never had to really worry about it. Even in Oklahoma, where it is quite humid for half the year, the other half of the year it is quite dry. But here it just, that consistency of humidity just seems to eat up those tools quite a bit. So it's definitely...
Yeah. And we've been talking strictly about hand tools here, for the most part, but the same goes for if you have a bandsaw or a table saw, or a joiner. The bed or the flat surface of those tools, those machine tools, are really prone to rusting as well. And so you want to make sure that when you're doing this kind of maintenance on your hand tools, you're also doing that on the flat surfaces of your table saw, bandsaw, joiner, anything like that as well. And you're probably going to have to do those a little bit more frequently. And the other nice part about doing that, especially with like a silicone-based product or something like that, of which there are numerous brands that will tell you that's specifically what they're for. It also lubricates and reduces the friction on those surfaces. So as you're trying to push a board through your bandsaw or through your table saw, you want to have as little friction between your board and that table surface as possible. And these help do that as well.
Very good. Very good.
All right. So I think next, should we talk about chisels?
Let's talk about chisels.
Let's do.
I mean,
all right.
I assume what we're going to be talking about on chisels will carry across to plane blades or whatever they're called, not blades. I know they're not called blades.
I have a plane here too, which we will also discuss.
Yes.
But let's talk chisels.
Okay.
So chisel maintenance is probably one of the things you're going to do a little bit more frequently. If you get your chisel set up correctly, meaning when you first get it, you make sure that your backside is completely flat, is dead flat, and that you have your bevel set well. What you're going to be able to do a lot of the time is you don't have to resharpen or rehone your chisel. You just need to strop it. And for that, I have a scrap piece of leather that I just glued onto a piece of plywood. And the reason I use plywood is because it's dimensionally stable. It is pretty doggone flat. If you use hardwood, it's gonna, warp and bulge over time and stuff. But if you use engineered wood like this, it won't move. And so there's a wax that you rub on your strop to just kind of help reduce friction and really polish up your blade nicely. And you just do some pull strokes on the bevel and then a couple on the flat. And you will notice a huge, huge difference in the edge of your chisel. Now, I'll probably only strop my chisels for probably 4 to 6 months at least. I know some people that only sharpen their chisels or gouges once a year. And that kind of depends on how good the steel is in your tools. So when it gets to the point that I can't just use a strop and do the fine honing, then you need to look at abrasives to really bring the edge of your tool back into shape. Now, the simplest way to do that is the same thing I did with my leather.
I was going to say the same thing you did with your saws. Send them to somebody else.
You can do that too. And there's also, a gajillion fancy tools for doing this, that you put them in a jig to do it on a, slow, wet grinding wheel. But again, there's nothing wrong with doing that. And some people will say, you'll hear some people say it's cheating. It's only cheating because some snob like me said it is.
Yeah.
But to give you an illustration, it's kind of like if you learn to play baseball with a corked bat. Like, yes.
I don't know what any of that means.
Okay. So
put it in cricket terms. Come on.
Well, you could do the same thing with a cricket bat, actually. A really old school method of cheating in baseball was that players would have their bat drilled out in the center and filled with cork, because that cork compresses and expands more, and it would actually allow you to hit a baseball a lot further. So the thing is, whether your bat is corked or not, you still have to learn how to swing properly and get the timing down and hit the baseball, for it to work. So yes, it's cheating, but you still, have to know the mechanics. I look at using a machine to sharpen my tools the same way. It gets the job done. I still have to learn how to set a bevel and do everything correctly on that machine, but I'm not getting the full effect of sharpening as I do by hand. And it's just like I talked about earlier. When you learn how to set these things by hand, you're working on your fine motor skills and your dexterity, and it improves other areas of your craft. So you're going to screw up in the beginning so much, which is why I recommend starting with cheap tools. There's nothing wrong with that. But the easiest way to get started is just like I did with the leather. You can just put abrasive paper on a piece of engineered plywood. They also sell like chunks of granite that are milled to within, like 1/1000th of an inch of dead flat. You can get thick pieces of glass to do the same, and you put your paper on that just with water. You just spray water on and let that kind of suction it down. But you start with a rougher grit, and the first thing you do is you always make sure that the back or the flat of your chisel is dead flat, and then you move to the bevel. And I don't know if you're gonna be able to see this really on a camera at all, but can you see that there's two different shines on that bevel? That's because on my rougher grits, whether I'm doing it with paper or I'm using a diamond stone like this one. On my roughest grits, I'm gonna set this bevel right here, this less shiny part. I'm gonna set that bevel all the way to the edge of my chisel.
That would be the primary bevel or the secondary
that's the primary bevel. Then when I get down to, let's see, this is 1200 grit is the fine diamond stone here. Then I'm going to set my chisel at a slightly steeper angle. So I've been sharpening like this on my stone or my sandpaper. Well, when I get down to 12,000 grit, I'm going to lift the handle of my chisel just slightly. And then I'm going to set my secondary bevel. If you do your chisels and your plane irons this way, you'll be able to get by with honing on a strop for a lot longer because you're leaving a lot more beef on this chisel. So I go up to 12,000 grit on my diamond stones, and then I go to 8,000 grit on a whetstone.
Okay.
So I just spray this with water. I literally have just a spray bottle of water that I keep this surface wet. I do the same thing on my diamond stones. You can use a diamond stone dry. I prefer to do it wet. That water provides a lubricant, which reduces heat buildup on your blade. Heat buildup is the devil when you are dealing with sharpening metal. Because if you heat up metal and let it cool slowly, you're doing what's called tempering. And you're taking the hardness out and replacing that hardness with elasticity.
Yeah, you're changing the crystalline structure of that metal and not the way it was intended.
Yes. And we don't want to change what the makers of the tool did because they set it for a reason. So my whetstone, which is 8,000 grit, I'm going to follow just that secondary bevel. I'm not going to worry about the primary bevel at all. That doesn't matter. Just my secondary bevel. And I'm going to do that. Each step I'm going to do until I have a burr on the back. And that burr is going to get progressively smaller and smaller each time we do this. And once you have a burr on the back, you flip it over, hit the flat side with just a couple strokes to take that burr off. And at this point, you're going to have a pretty doggone sharp chisel, but you're not done. Because the last thing you need to do is do that final honing on your strop. And once you do that, that secondary bevel is going to be like a mirror. I mean, it is going to be incredibly reflective. And I haven't done it for a little while. That's why you can't tell quite as much on this. But you can see that this primary bevel is much more flat in its reflection than my secondary bevel is.
Yep.
So that is probably, it's probably one of the most daunting maintenance things you will do is to sharpen chisels and plane irons. I will tell you that I don't really use this much anymore. But in the beginning, this was pretty crucial for me. You can get a little guide like this that helps you keep your chisels and plane irons at the correct angle. After a while, you get a feel for it. Just by hand, you know if you're on the bevel or not.
We'll ignore the rust on this.
Yep, I will. I'm not even looking.
It's only on the bearing part, but it's all good.
So the last thing I have here, the last major thing I have here is a plane. And this one is a rabbiting or a rebate plane. But I chose this one because you can see the insides essentially. You know, on a block plane, this is all enclosed and you can't see it. But you can see that inside this throat of the plane, we have the iron, which is the really thin metal. And on top of it is what's called the frog or the chip breaker. And all that part does is help get the wood shavings up and away and cleared out of the throat so that we don't clog the plane. And it also adds some rigidity to the leading edge of the plane. But when it's time to sharpen these and do maintenance on your planes, you are going to maintain the iron itself, just like we did our chisels. That process is the exact same. And if you're watching, you can see there's some, discoloration and pitting and stuff on this, because this is a really old Stanley plane. I don't buy new planes because I think it's a little bit ridiculous. I can find an old Stanley or other good brand name tools and bring them back to life, which I prefer to do. But this iron is what you're going to have to work on most frequently. And again, you can take this iron out and just strop it for a long time before you have to rehone. But the other thing that's really, really important on your planes is the sole of your plane, which is the flat piece that rides on the wood as you're planing. And whether you have a full metal body plane like this one, or you have a hybrid plane, which will have a wood body like this and metal guts, or you have a full wood plane, you need to make sure that your sole of your plane is lubricated and is well maintained. So from a maintenance standpoint, just taking care of it after it's already set up, all that is using on this metal plane, it's using a product like we did on our surfaces of our machine tools, or you can even use paste wax, which is what I use a lot. And I have a tin can that's filled with paste wax that has a sock. Like the paste wax is actually in a sock, which is balled up and shoved in this. And I can just rub that on here and get a nice, small coat, and then use a clean rag to buff it off. That's what I find to be the easiest way to do it. And from a maintenance standpoint, that's really all you got to do. If we're talking about a plane that you just picked up secondhand, then you'll want to make sure that the sole of your plane is dead flat.
My understanding is if you buy a cheap plane, you want to make sure that's flat as well.
Actually, I do it on anything I buy.
Yeah.
So if I spend, I've only done this once, and it was for a very specific plane. But if you buy a $400 plane, the first thing I do when I take it out of the box is I grab my flat surface with abrasive paper and I check the sole, because it's not going to be perfect even on a super high-end tool. It's just not going to be. And it's definitely not going to be if you buy an old secondhand one. But you just take that flat surface abrasive paper and you're going to work it over that for ages to make sure that you have a consistent flat surface here. And then once you get it there, if you're maintaining it, you never have to do that again. So that's kind of the last of the big stuff. What other questions do you have, Andrew? What else can I convert you on?
I think that pretty well covers it. I mean, I obviously have pneumatic tools now, and I have a few power tools and things like router bits and things like that. And a lot of that's all going to be very similar. A lot of it's going to be read the manufacturer's instructions, follow those. Don't get lazy like I do. The tool, if you look after your tools will look after you. And obviously I'm joking a little bit with some of this. I do some maintenance, not as much as I should, but I don't completely neglect it. And I guess the one thing I wanted to note is that some tools, there are consumables like an electric planer. Those blades you will have to replace. You just replace them. You replace them and you're fine. Same with like Stanley knives or blades, scalpels, things like that. You can sharpen them a little bit. I know guys that work with foam a lot. If you're cutting foam, it does dull blades, and you can just quickly, guys generally just have some kind of just sharpening kit, stone of some description, and you can just quickly WD-40 or whatever and throw it over that. But eventually you will have to throw some of that stuff out, and it's just the nature of those tools. Don't get too cut up about it. Excuse the pun. But yeah, and that's kind of all I wanted to add, was just for some of those other tools, if they are expendables, you just have to replace them. With the electric planer, that was definitely a big learning curve for me. Was that those blades need to be replaced quite often.
Well, actually, let's come back to your planer in just a second, because you said something earlier that was really important about router bits.
Yep.
Router bits are another thing. They're probably the thing that you will see resin buildup on the fastest. And same process goes for those, as we talked about earlier. Clean them up, and you're going to see a much better cut out of them. Make sure that you sharpen them. I use my diamond sticks for those as well. Even on curved, profiled, I use those. You can also, if you have really ornately curved router bits, like trim bits like that, you can get diamond files. So like a needle file set, but it's diamond instead of metal. That's a good way to go for those. Now your router, the irons in your electric planer. So whether we're talking about a hand planer or a thickness planer, those actually can be sharpened. And they can be sharpened usually about, I've found I can do it about 4 times before they need to be replaced. And the only reason they need to be replaced is because they're not long. Not like
there's not a lot of metal
that you can work it down to about here. They're very thin. And when it comes to sharpening the blades for my planer, I invested in a nice little tool, which you can easily actually make yourself. But for the money, I just bought one. But it's basically a wood block. It has 2 square sharpening stones embedded in it. The first stone is set at a 90-degree angle for sharpening the flat, and the other is set at the appropriate angle, which is, I believe, 30 or 35 degrees. I can never remember offhand. And that's for sharpening your bevel. Unless you are putting stuff through your planer that you shouldn't be, like things that have staples or old nails in them, your planing blades are probably just going to get dull. So you can sharpen them up. If you're putting things through that you shouldn't be, or if you're doing woods that have a lot of hard knots in them, then you might get some chips. At that point, you're going to need to replace. But you can actually sharpen those. And the nice thing about that block is I can actually sharpen those without taking them out of my planer. Just make sure your planer is unplugged first.
Yeah, and it goes without saying that whenever you're handling these tools, obviously if you're handling a chisel or other things, make sure you're being careful and following all good protocol, working away from yourself. And especially with the sharper they get, and if you've been doing it for a few minutes, you might start wandering with some of these maintenance things. So just be careful.
That being said, the most dangerous tool in your shop is a dull tool. For sure. Because when you have a dull tool that you're working with, you're forcing it through material harder. You're probably not using good body ergonomics, and you're putting yourself at a higher risk for a slip or, making a mistake that ends up in you bleeding, which brings me to my small safety tip for the day, which is have a first aid kit in your shop. Yep. Even if you're not, working commercially, you're just doing it as fun. It's really a good practice to pay attention to what the requirements are in a commercial shop, because they're there for a reason. And having a first aid kit and having a fire extinguisher really readily at hand is incredibly important.
Or a fire blanket. Fire blankets are great as well.
Yep. Fire blanket works good too.
So that's what I actually built a little while ago. Is I wanted something to house all of my stuff that was easily identifiable for what it is, and that actually has all of my safety gear in it as well. So each of my children have a set of earmuffs. They all have a set of safety glasses. There's a mask in there. So basically they know that if they want to come into the workshop, that's where they go to get that stuff. And then it's quite identifiable as that's where my first aid kit is. Because yes, incidents have occurred in this shop. Unfortunately, it's been quite a while since I've had one. So I must be starting to listen to some of your advice there, Chili, which is great. So with that, I think that was a great episode. We enjoy these special episodes. If you have any ideas for other kind of these special episodes where we talk about kind of different aspects of being in the workshop, not necessarily what is on our workbench, feel free to shoot ideas to us and we will definitely look at those. I think we've got a few more ideas about what we might cover off in future episodes. I know I want to talk about commissions and getting paid to make things, which is a whole new experience for me and something that you've had a bit of experience. But is there any kind of tease as to what we might see on your next project or the next week's workbench, Chili?
I'm leaving a nice pause there because you're probably going to have to cut this.
But
I want to jump back to something I forgot about.
Oh, let's go. No cuts. Let's jump.
Your beloved pneumatic tools.
Yes.
Which are fantastic. Do you oil them each time you use them?
I really want to lie to you and say yes, but I don't. It is every time I use them, I'm like, I need to oil them, and they get put back.
This is super, super easy to do, and super, super easy to forget. But when you're using pneumatic tools, the most important thing is to make sure they stay lubricated. And the way you do that with the vast majority of pneumatic tools is before you plug that air hose in, you just put 2-3 drops of pneumatic oil right into the tool, right into where the air hose attaches. Pop your air hose in, and the air carries the lubricant through the tool. You can over lubricate, and it will gum up your tool over time as dirt gets in there too, which is no bueno. But if you don't lubricate at all, you will fry the O-rings and other seals in your pneumatic tool, and it will stop working. Then you have to take it apart and replace those, and that is not fun.
Yep. And I guess the other thing with pneumatic tools is your air compressor, making sure you're draining that of any fluid, especially for people like us that are in a humid environment that builds up with fluid. And if you've done something like me, where you've put it in a nice box, which is to help with the sound, and you've got it in a cupboard, and obviously you've got ventilation still, but to get it out and to drain it is painful. So I guess that's the other thing with maintenance is just accept it. It's kind of like making your bed or doing your dishes. You're going to have to do it. So don't think too much about it. Don't go, oh, I don't want to do it. It's just accept that you've got to do it. And I'm hoping that, I feel like this is going to the dentist where you just feel real guilty and you know exactly why you feel guilty.
Or for your air compressor in the cabinet, I don't, mine's too large for that. So I don't have that. But what I've seen other guys do when they have their compressors like built into their workbench, like a pancake compressor or whatever, I've seen some guys basically just move their plumbing externally from their bench. So they'll take a piece of hard copper and pipe that valve outside of the bench so that they can drain there. And I've even seen some of them that have like a water catch even underneath it and stuff, which, but I'm really glad you brought that up because this is something I'm super, super stickler about because in my previous world, I worked with pressure vessels, like boilers, and your air compressor is a pressure vessel. And what happens when that water, that condensation builds in your compressor is that it is very, very pure water. And very pure water doesn't want to be pure. It wants minerals. So it'll actually take the minerals out of the metal of your compressor vessel and it will eat away at the metal. And it will eat away until one day you have 120 pounds of pressure in your vessel and not enough metal to hold it there. And it will explode just like a water heater can or things like that. And it will not just make a little sound, it will launch through the ceiling.
Yep.
So yes, 100%. I'm glad you said that.
100%. So yeah, no, that's definitely a good note on air compressors, and that's a new world for me. So it's definitely something that I've still got a lot to learn about, as much as I love having it.
Yeah,
but that's definitely a good idea about being able to just tap it out and have the access out. So I've got a pretty big access panel that I can kind of get into it, but it's definitely not something that I'm as fastidious about as I should be, but it is something I'm at least aware of. So
the other thing that's really good to do is put a line dryer on your hose.
Yeah,
so you're not sending that condensation to your tools.
Okay, yeah, that's a good idea.
It's generally not super important for, a pin nailer, brad nailer, whatever. Especially if you use your compressor for any sort of finish work and spraying.
Yep.
Definitely need to have a line dryer on it.
Yep. Which I haven't done yet, but one day, hopefully I will. All right. Thanks for that, Chili. I think that was really good. I think I've learned a lot, and hopefully I haven't forgotten all of it already. But fortunately, I can just go back and listen to this episode if I ever need to. So where can people find more about you, Chili?
Well, if you want to find more about Orwood Solutions, you can find me on Facebook at Orwood Solutions. Also the same at YouTube or on Instagram at Orwood CS. And if you want to find more about this fantastical podcast, which is, if you haven't caught on yet, the greatest podcast that has ever been created in the history of not just podcasts, but I dare to say recorded sound.
Wow. Wow, setting us up for probably not success, Chili. I'm just going to throw it out there.
You can find us on your favorite podcast streaming applications, such as the iTunes, the Spotify, or directly at Podbean, which is, I think it's what's on your workbench.podbean.com.
100%. And if you want to find more about me, craftybeetroot.com is my website, and Crafty Beetroot on the YouTubes, and you will find more of my videos. And this is on the YouTubes under What's on Your Workbench. So with that, I guess we didn't quite cover off about what potentially you'll be doing on the next project on your next week, but we will just leave that as a surprise for next week. So with that, we'll find out next week what is on your workbench.